The town that shouldn't exist, a nightmare becomes reality. Actually knew if I was legally permitted to enter, but I pretended that I was. Well, it's my job, and he has the right to visit us, so yeah, he said, abruptly interrupting me with a sympathetic sigh. Just don't let him get to you, he said, leading me back through a few dim hallways, the back of which housed the temporary cells, and he unlocked the first gate. I'll wait here while Grayson is in the final cell. All right, I went in by myself and passed through the gated cells. The final one was occupied by the lone person in the life emergency room. His previously respectable business attire was covered in blood, true, but he wasn't the violent figure I had imagined. Instead, he was a tall, lanky man with thinning gray hair who appeared to be a gentle elderly man. He might have been a perfect match for one of my professors back at the university if he had had glasses. For a brief moment, I was disappointed because it didn't seem likely that there would be an amazing story here, just some sort of mix-up. That feeling lasted only until he started talking and he saw my media badge, my pen and paper, and my sighed with resignation. I guess you want my story, I thought. After giving it some thought, I do think that I should tell someone what happened. I know how it sounds, so I've largely kept quiet up to this point, but I'll tell you what I haven't told the police because that will fulfill my ethical obligation. It's the least required and the most I'm willing to do because of the social risk. You look young and sharp, but most people won't. I don't want to end up in an institution. Thank you. Now, I must admit that this all started a long time ago. I was younger than you, and the memories came back to me with the fog of my early youth, probably preteen. They were nightmares, and you see, they haunted me for almost a year. My parents did everything they could to find me treatment, but the nightmares only stopped when I briefly joined the church, but I still put that down to coincidence. The religious issue is a whole other discussion. It's been 30 years, give or take, and I'm traveling cross-country for work with my partner. What I'm doing has nothing to do with what happened. Smith and I were traveling cross-country in an AC car when we pulled over at a rundown motel just outside of a small town. After hours of seeing nothing but Midwestern farm fields, we decided to wander into town for a beer. Glenworth Heights could have been any other, as you can see. The town looks like a million others in yours, which is why I brought up my childhood nightmares. Standing on that short main street, I had the strangest feeling of déjà vu. I thought I recognized that specific pattern of shop fronts and that the sign said Glenworth Heights had 45 residents. It was just a stopover on the way to somewhere else, but I had seen those buildings before, cast in a different light and context. In the nightmare, I had seen the sky bleeding, I had seen these buildings rotting, and the people who lived there had become misshapen and mutated. Smith was able to tell when I was frightened because I stayed rigid but made an effort to ignore the unsettling sensation and calm his worries. Whatever facade of composure I was able to put on definitely vanished as soon as we entered the liquor store. I had called to mind the clerk's face before I entered, telling myself that he couldn't possibly be there because I'd had a nightmare more than 30 years ago about a 20-something hippie whose facial skin had been carefully excised in front of me by steaming hooks. In that dream world, his jaw muscles and bleeding cheek were exposed to the air, but he continued working the front, and maybe I had visited this town on a family road trip when I was younger, and maybe I would have nightmares about it later, but how could I have imagined that 30 years ago, a Clark was here? The store owner was hiding in the back room, a thuggish man wearing a yellowed white shirt lounging next to a fan. I left the store right away, and Smith realized something was wrong. He became aggressive, but I reassured him that everything was okay. He knew I needed the money from our business trip to pay child support to my shrew ex-wife's owner. I wasn't going to Welch, but I was also worried because I had discovered a waking link to my childhood nightmares, and those nightmares had posed a clear threat. The town in my dreams hadn't just been awful for strange reasons, rather, a gaping fissure in the earth had opened somewhere nearby through that enormous searing crevice, and I had seen people clapping at the screams. Don't frown with disbelief, it was just a nightmare. It was a metaphor for fear, pain, and change. The town's residents had all changed, and they marched to the gap to worship it, widen it, and bring demons through. Burning air from rivers of torturous bile, blinding crimson and azure flames, kept thousands of people alive forever. Unbeknownst to me, it was only a dream, but I did dream about where the fissure. I couldn't leave Smith because he was suspicious, but I made up a tale about going back to check on money I had left on a previous business trip. We strolled into the sparse woods behind the town, and Smith kept his hand close to his gun, but I was much more concerned about running into that terrible rift. I was quite happy to discover that the forest was deserted. Glenn, and then calmly realized that I had seen this scene in a state of actual meditation as I recalled the arrangement of the tumbled rocks, waving grasses, and tall trees. I strayed out into the sky. Once I was outside in the middle, I noticed that the assembled rocks were scattered in a pattern that was anything but random. It was a huge circle, and I was bending down when I found the particular rocks I remembered being split apart before they had started belching flames. Runes. The rocks had runes in them, ancient runes that looked Native American or something. Smith, who was even older, smiled close to me. When I touched the rocks, he assumed that I had found the place where I had hidden my alleged cash. He also assumed that I was far superior to his usual class of partners, even though I must have had a sizable sum hidden there. I lifted one of the rude rocks, and while his skull caved in, he was dead instantly. No, this blood on my shirt isn't from hitting him with a rock, and that's not why they brought me in. That act was self-defense, and I'll prove that in a court of law, or I'll at least get the jury to understand a dead thug and a living well-mannered man like myself. I'm not worried about it. Don't make that face, I'm just being honest. But no, this isn't that blood on my dirt, because the blood from that impact shot to the earth like it had been pulled down by strange gravities. In fact, the red liquid spurted out of his head, wound like a fountain, arcing right down to those ruined rocks before me and disappearing between. It wasn't nearly all of the blood in his body, but it was enough to be surprising. The rest soaked his clothes and the surrounding ground. Was it simply a nearby death that had reawakened latent energies? Or perhaps I'd accidentally reenacted some ancient ritual. In either case, I found myself standing in exactly the spot I dreamed 30 years before, watching that exact nightmare unfold. The ground splitting. What sane person would have stayed in such a place? Hell itself had partially erupted into a half-mile-wide glen in the forest, some ancient ritual site. Flames were erupting, and fiery heat was radiating against my face as the screams of countless damned souls erupted into the real world. I had the last of my composure to take the keys out of Smith's pocket as I hurried back to town with the intention of obtaining our car, but I did need something to help me relax. I knew I wouldn't be able to drive because my hand was shaking so much, so I went into the town pharmacy. I was already familiar with the elderly woman, and her kind grin matched my bizarre early recollections. Her doddering husband worked the cash register while she picked out what I had requested, and I shuddered in my dream. The old woman's skull had split open, and her brain had grown teeth, creating a fleshy mold large enough to crush and eat her terrified husband's face. He died gurgling and betrayed by his lifelong love, and his corpse had started turning inside out, growing 1,000 little spider-like limbs from the inner edges of his skin and muscles. His corpse had been chasing my terrified child self down Main Street, music, relentlessly, and my only escape had been waking up in a screaming sweat. I remembered him saying this yesterday, syllable for syllable. "What are you looking at?" He was asking out of confusion and kindness, not angry that I had been staring at him while lost in memory. He wasn't angry that I had been staring at him. Instead, he was just worried about me until the teeth slammed down and his face crumpled between brain matter. Not waiting for his corpse to come to life, I ran in a state of blurry panic as jaws leaped back and knocked over product-filled shelves. I screamed in complete terror, because who wouldn't? The sky was bubbling over the town, almost boiling, like a rapidly building normal storm. It wasn't blood like I dreamed, but I knew that there were screams echoing up and down the street, not the screams of the damned, but rather the screams of the living, those unfortunate souls who hadn't yet turned. Being Sla, I wasn't changing. Why wasn't I changing? Had my presence at the ritual site protected me, or was it the fact that these people had lived nearby the site their entire lives? Were they more susceptible somehow? On my desperate run back to the motel and to my car, I almost bowled over a startled old man who'd been heading into town. His skin was bled and he was very frail. He gripped my arm with surprising strength though and screamed at me to be heard over the raging winds. He said, "What have you done, boy? I saw you. What did you do out in the woods? Did you disturb the stone ring?" My horrified stare was all the confirmation he needed. He went on. "The ring is a barely cracked seal and the pled townsfolk are going to try and widen the crack, perhaps destroy the seal completely. I'm too old to do what must be done. You must either move whatever sacrifice you made and burn the corpse, or you must return to the town and kill every single one of the monsters those people had become." I stared at Grayson, my mouth dropping a half-inch. Goddamn, had this guy gone on a killing spree? I mean, I would have too if that had all really happened to me. "So the blood on your shirt, you killed all those people?" He looked at me as if I was a do I look like some goddamn enforcer? I've never fought a man in my life. Kill 40-odd horrible mutated monsters all by myself? No, that would have never worked. I see. So he'd gone back and moved Smith's body. That explained the blood on his shirt. Did that mean there was still a small town populated by mutated horrors out there, or had closing the rift destroyed or dispelled them somehow? "All right, I've explained everything to you." And he stated unequivocally that any ethical duty I may have had is now fulfilled. "You're left feeling bewildered." The officer who let me in nodded when he saw my face. "You're a real piece of work," he said, and I left after saying my goodbyes politely. Knowing that he hadn't been told Grayson's story, I asked him, "What do you think it was?" I froze right at the front door to the station outside, torrential rains beating down on the glass among all of his other faults. He said quietly, leading me back towards the front, "Killed 3 kids." At first, I thought, how horrible could one person be? He had children he'd walked out on, he was involved in crime, and he was vaguely racist. At least he'd gone back and waited, so he had blood on his shirt from the car accident. Grayson was also a coward because he had disregarded warnings from decades-old dreams that had guided him to the location and time of a massive catastrophe, knowing what was going to happen. Rather than becoming a hero, he had ruined everything and left with the thought, is that the true nature of human beings? How many terrifying stories had I heard in my life, expecting that I would rise to the occasion if they ever happened to me? I was also doing nothing about it. What else could I do but stare out the window? I had no proof, so if I had, I could have called for help or gone there and tried to kill 40 or so mutated monsters by myself. The thoughts made me tremble, and I kept thinking, am I a coward too? I didn't want to believe him, but there was a strange feeling that, even though I had no proof, the story of the century, my first big break and possibly my last, would probably not be believed by anyone. Now, all I can do is post this message online and hope that someone takes action, or that Grayson was lying. After that, I'll watch the unusually heavy rain and pray to God that it doesn't turn red.